Hi and welcome. We're going to talk today about Chapter 3, which is on sensation and perception. So your learning objectives are going to come first. You can review those. The first thing is kind of an exercise. So just right now, to get us in the mood for talking about sensation and perception, what I'd ask for you to do is think about what you hear, see, smell, feel, and taste. So right now I taste iced coffee that I just drank. I smell my fancy air freshener over there. So just think about what it is that you're experiencing. This process of experiencing is coming from two overlapping processes. So you're getting your sensation, which is the physical kind of properties of the light or the sound waves or the dissolvable chemicals that you're currently experiencing. And you have to detect that physical stimulus. That process is sensation. The other part of this is perception. So that's where you take those sensations and you interpret them, organize them. So you might say, oh look, here's color splotches at the bottom, this picture, and you're getting that light information in. But then you would also take that and interpret it and determine, hey, that's fruit. I can kind of see some outlines of some tangerines in there. What I'm looking at is fruit. So you have both sensation and perception. The book gives a great graphic to explain this difference. You have 6 major senses, so a lot of people are surprised to see pain up there. Pain is one that we less often mention, or that's not as described as much, but it's important because it has these processes in common with the other senses. So the processes in common, we have the stimulation of our sensory receptors by physical energy. So one source of maybe physical energy might be this slice of pizza here. So if you're going to eat this pizza, you're going to have a sensory experience associated with that pizza. So you're going to hear the crunch, which is sound waves. You're going to taste these dissolvable chemicals that taste cheesy. You're going to smell airborne chemicals and get that garlic smell. You're going to feel a lot of information from your skin, warmth, the gooiness of the pizza, pressure and temperature. You're going to see the yellow, the red. And if you drop it on your face or on your chest, then you're going to have that experience of pain. So eating a piece of pizza is a very sensory-rich experience. Some of the terminology that's going to branch across all of these senses is that we have sensory receptors. So these are these specialized cells in each organ that's responding to that physical energy. And we're going to have this process of transduction where we have that physical energy that's kind of coded into electrical impulses that can be processed by your nervous system. So obviously we talked about the nervous system in Chapter 2, so we know all about that. I'm not going to give this away, but these videos are pretty fun. You might want to watch them, and they really get across the point that we're not going to sense everything. We don't sense everything. So why don't we sense everything, or what kind of things can we not sense? We can't sense things that fall under our absolute threshold for sensory input. So the book is going to give us a few of these. The ticking of a watch at 20 feet, that's our absolute threshold. We can't hear it then at 50 feet or 100 feet. Our absolute threshold for most people is going to be at 20 feet. So this kind of gives us, I think it's really interesting that we could possibly see a candle flame 30 miles away. I don't think that I could do that. I don't have great vision, as you can tell, but 50% of the time it could be detected. The other threshold that's important is the difference threshold, which we call the just noticeable difference. The just noticeable difference is really important for consumer behavior. Big reason why is people are going to want to make changes to their life, but they're not going to want it to be so drastic that you purchase it and say, oh, this is totally different. So we've got an example here of Cadbury is making small changes over time to their product label. So we want to make it where you just don't notice every iteration. For the difference, the Weber's law comes in. And this law seems really complicated, but all it's saying is that if you're holding a pebble, so if you put your hand out, I stick a pebble here. If I add that one pebble, you're going to feel it. If you're holding a boulder up, though, and I come place a pebble on top of that boulder, probably not going to feel it. So it's just in proportion to the size of that initial stimulus. Sensory adaptation is something that I'm grateful for all the time, and this just says that we adapt to a constant stimulus. So I used to work at IHOP. I would smell maple syrup when I first got there, but eventually I just adapted to it. So I wasn't smelling maple syrup for 8 hours of a shift. This is also how we can understand people living in houses that maybe are hoarded out, covered in animal feces or stink. Most of us would say, how can you live in something like that? But people become adapted to the sights and the smells of this type of living. So sensory adaptation is an important thing. Subliminal perception is a little bit different, and this is the idea that we can detect some stimuli that are below our threshold of conscious perception. We know that this has a brief influence on behavior, but nothing major. So you can review the study in the book to describe that. But these subliminal messages, we often think they have more of an impact than they do. So it seems like Disney is often a target for this. They say, oh, look at the subliminal messages here in Disney movies, but we know that it's not really going to be a huge impact on people's behavior. That's going to move us on into vision. So for vision, we are going to talk about vision probably the most out of any of the senses. The book is going to designate a lot of time towards vision. With vision, our energy is this electromagnetic energy. It travels in waves. We have this visible light spectrum that you can see here, so there's a lot of waves that we don't perceive necessarily as visible light. The visual pathway is delineated in the book, so it'll kind of show how this experience happens. The parts of the eye I have added to the graphic here from the book to kind of explain these parts of the eye a little bit more, so you can review that information. The retina is really important because this is where we get our rods and our cones, which are our photoreceptors. Our cones, we get some information about those, but really those are active in daylight, responsible for our color vision. Our rods are more in the periphery of the eye. We have more rods than we do cones, and this is what helps us see at night. They take a little bit longer to adjust and to actually see. The blind spot, this is really, really fun. This is something you could do in the text. It'll give you the spider graphic, so you can try that, and it'll allow you to test your blind spot where you have no photoreceptors. And the route from the eye to the brain, this is also kind of described here in this graphic, but an important thing is that we do see information from the right visual field, kind of going back and through this optic chiasm and ending in the left hemisphere, the left visual field, going over to the right hemisphere. So we see that contralateral control. The experience of color, these differences in wavelengths, we perceive them as color, so we can pick up on the hue, the wavelength differences. We can also pick up on things like saturation, so how pure is the color, how bright is the color. If you remember on social media, they had this huge fallout over this dress. What color is the dress? Is it blue and black? Is it white and gold? I think was the other. And that video link there kind of explains, I think it's that one, but explains a little bit about that phenomenon from a scientific perspective. We've got some theories of color vision that you can review. Both of these have a grain of truth. So a trichromatic theory is the idea that we have 3 cone types. This can help to explain our color blindness. The opponent process theory, instead of having different cone types, it says we have opposing pairs. When one is stimulated, the other is inhibited. And this helps explain things like after images. So if you view this image for a while, you just kind of stare at it for 30 seconds or so, and then shift your vision to some blank space, you're going to be able to see this shifting. That's going to pull us out of vision, though. We're going to spend a little bit of time in hearing. But the important thing about hearing, one thing I wanted to mention, is that we don't go over, for the purposes of this class, we don't go over the ear in a lot of detail. So of course you can read that information. We can always talk about it if it's something you're truly interested in, but you don't need to know every part of the ear. We're not going to go into a lot of detail there. For hearing, our energy, or form of energy that we're picking up on is sound waves. We've got some characteristics of sound listed here. One I've got in bold is really important is the timbre, which is this distinctive, kind of complex view or ability that we have to perceive the human voice. So it's a distinctive, complex quality. So if you hear somebody like Kesha, if you hear her singing timbre, which is why I've got that in here, because the timbre reminds me of timbre. But if you hear that song, you're going to know, hey, that's Kesha. You're going to be able to recognize that quality of her human voice. This chart's going to give you some of the decibel levels. An important thing to see here is that when things get too loud, when we have too high decibels, it can be dangerous to your hearing. Big reason it's dangerous to your hearing is because these sensory receptors for sound, which are our hair cells, they can be damaged. They can be damaged with loud noises, such as hearing things that are too high of a decibel, or with age. So this video will kind of let you test your own hearing to see how well you're hearing. The next senses we just talk about very briefly, so we spend most of the time in vision and in hearing. But with smell, an important thing to realize for this is that your brain's going to interpret the patterns of smell. So it's got lots of different receptors, but it doesn't have individual receptors for every single thing you might eat or smell. So you don't have like a baby poop receptor here, here in your nose, and a chicken parmesan receptor here. You've got a lot of different receptors, but really your brain is interpreting or perceiving those patterns. And our receptor cells are in our olfactory bulb, so we've got this lovely image here of the person sniffing the strawberry, and you can see how they're perceiving those smells. For gustation, our taste, a lot of people are familiar with the basic tastes. One that many people may not be familiar with is this umami, and this is something like an MSG or Parmesan cheese, kind of a savory taste that we have. Super tasters are people who can have a far greater sensitivity to taste than maybe more normal or standard people who might be a little bit less able to taste. We know that this is linked into genetics. You can watch that video and kind of see how you can test your own ability to super taste, but it's definitely an interesting idea. You can also buy little strips on Amazon if you're really interested to test you and your friends to see if you're super tasters. Our skin and our body, we have several receptors for touch, but for pain we have nociceptors, our receptors. And substance P plays a huge role in the experience of pain. So substance P is this neurotransmitter that's going to increase our pain messages. And we know what a neurotransmitter is from the previous chapter, chapter 2. This book gives us a great graphic here. I love this picture of the guy getting his fingers caught in the window, not because I like watching people experiencing that kind of pain, but because it really gives us a good description of this fast versus slow pain experience. So the fast pain being that which you feel immediately, that sensory experience, pain. And the slow pain being more of the emotional or having more emotional quality to it. It's when you might feel that pain for a couple weeks every time you touch something, and it's just much harder to deal with for most of us. That's where you really get somebody kind of breaking down a little bit with emotion. Chronic pain sufferers experience a lot with that. So this graphic will give you a really good depiction of what's happening. Our movement, position, and balance senses, the kinesthetic sense, it's our knowledge of our body and space. So if this gentleman goes to drink his coffee, he's probably going to take a drink, not throw it on his head, because he knows where his body is. The vestibular sense is our sense of balance. It has a lot to do with our ear. Synesthesia is this really interesting phenomenon where you have two or more senses kind of cross involuntarily, so you might always see the number 5 written in green. The video gives a really cool depiction of that. I'm going to spend the last couple minutes on perception. Extrasensory perception is this idea that we're getting information by some means other than our normal sensation. The majority of psychologists don't really believe in ESP. We haven't found a lot of experimental evidence to suggest that this is occurring. How we process things, we have two different ways, a bottom-up or a top-down. Our bottom-up is taking just basic information from our sensory receptors and building a picture. Generally, though, we use a lot of top-down processes. So if I were to look at this picture, I'm not going to say, oh, this is two people whose bodies are made out of monkeys, because I don't see their bodies. All I see is monkeys. We're not going to go through that. We're going to say instead, this must be two people holding a plethora of monkeys that are covering their body. So we use our cognitive processes. The Gestalt psychologists perceived whole figures, so this is a form of psychology where they said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They'd be very interested in how we can perceive like a triangle in A instead of just white space. Our figure-ground relationship you can review in the book, but generally with camouflage we notice the figure, but we don't notice the ground. We don't notice the background. We've got different depth perception cues. Your book goes into this quite heavily, but really you don't need to spend a ton of time in our depth perception cues. The monocular we can see with one eye, binocular you need two. You can read about how our motion perception occurs, but really when the retinal image enlarges, when you see something in your retina bigger, we know it's moving toward us. If it gets smaller, we know it's moving away. So that's how we can perceive. Illusions are super fun, so I have some illusions embedded into here. There's illusions you can get on the web, tons of cool stuff. But illusions we really understand or are interested in because they help us understand how people normally perceive different things. And I have a bunch of illusions taped in here so you can kind of see that. But that's going to pull us out of chapter 3. And I'll see you again for Chapter 5.